Hello and welcome to episode 81 of the Chills at Will podcast. And I'm appreciative in a million ways, but one of the ways is that poor guy's in a little bit of pain right now. There he is. Welcome to Dave Zirin. And I'll tell you a little bit about Dave. How do you not know already? But he's a nation's sports editor. He's the author of 10 books on the politics of sports. Most recently, The Kaepernick Effect, Taking a Knee, Changing the World, which will be the main focus of our talk today. Named one of UTNE readers' 50 visionaries who are changing the world, Zirin is a frequent guest on ESPN, MSNBC, and Democracy Now! He also hosts the nation's Edge of Sports podcast. You can find all his work or contact him through his website, edgeofsports.com. That's all as one word. You can follow him on Twitter as well, at Edge of Sports. Again, all as one word. Dave, thanks so much for joining me today. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing okay. I don't let the back fool you, because the mind is clear. So
There
I'm
you
ready.
go. Good. I hope you're doing better mentally than physically. I'm sorry to hear that.
Absolutely.
I know your back pain. I know what that's like. You're I want to say 3 days away from the publishing date for the Kaepernick Effect.
Yes, as of this discussion, 3 days away.
Oh man, so we're talking on 9/11 on September 11th. How are you feeling as the book is about to go to out to the public?
I'm excited. I feel a real sense of mission about this book for a
Mhm.
couple of reasons. First and foremost, I feel like this has been an underdiscussed, if not undiscussed, national movement for the last 4 or 5 years.
Right.
And what I'm talking about is the title of the book, The Kaepernick Effect, which is the replication of Colin Kaepernick's protest of taking a knee during the anthem to protest racial inequity and police violence. The replication of that and the spreading of that protest from all parts of the country, from Beaumont, Texas to Seattle, Washington, from California to upstate New York, from Florida to DC. Like this is what the book is about. So I feel this terrific sense of mission about getting it in people's hands. And I'm excited. I mean, it's a small thing, but my proceeds from the book are going to this organization in DC that I really believe in called Serve Your City. It's a mutual aid organization. And I also like that thematically with the whole point of the book, which is
Sure.
that people did these things for the broader community, not for themselves.
Right.
Would just like Colin Kaepernick, I believe, sacrificed his career for a broader community as opposed to for his own self-enrichment.
No doubt. Serve Your City, I assume with a nice Google search. Is there a website that you know of?
Yeah. ServeYourCityDC.com.
ServeYourCityDC.com. That's great. You're rocking the Baltimore.
I'm sorry, I got to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Just because I was just like, is that right? It's ServeYourCityDC.org.
.org. Okay.
Not .com.
Got to get it right. Appreciate that.
Get it right.
Appreciate that. You're rocking the Baltimore Orioles hat. Are you from Maryland, Boston, sorry, Baltimore area originally? Where did you grow
Oh,
up?
no. I was born and raised in New York City.
Okay.
Diehard sports fan of the New York teams, but I've lived out here in the DC area, now on the Maryland side, for about 2 decades. My son is a diehard Orioles fan, and after this interview, we're on our way to the park for a doubleheader against the Toronto Blue Jays.
Nice. It's been a tough year for the Orioles, right? Is that
But
putting it
only
lightly?
5 games out of first place. I don't know
Oh,
what
okay.
anyone has to complain about.
Okay.
But I'll tell you, the best thing, though, is that if you love baseball and you believe in social distancing during a pandemic, there's no better stadium right now than Camden Yards.
They'll be back. Okay. All right. I thought I heard some of the New York accent. So tell me a little bit about growing up. Did you grow up in a household full of books, full of political talk, sports talk? I guess first and foremost, what was your relationship with the written word?
I mean, it's a great question. And when I think about it, what it comes down to is sort of the defining moment of my childhood was my parents splitting up. And when I was 3, and I have an older sister. And, when you have an older sibling, you tend to get to things a little younger than you would otherwise,
Sure.
as in everything from music to your first sip of beer. You're 2 years ahead of the game because you're 2 years behind for me, in my case, 2 years behind my older sibling. And my sister is just a reader of the first order. And, because my mom was out working a lot of the time, we with each other watching the same TV shows, but there were strict rules on TV. So a lot of time really was spent reading. So I started by reading a lot of what she was into, but I also had this obsession with sports. So it was a real mix of these kinds of like frankly, female literary giants like the
Hmm.
Brontes or Jane Austen. I mean, Toni Morrison. These books were on my sister's shelf, and so I would look at them, but I was also reading Season on the Brink,
Ah.
really everything by John Feinstein. I was writing letters to Bobby Knight. I was writing letters to the New York Mets. I mean, so anything that was sports related. Once I sort of figured out how to use my local library, I took
Hmm.
the reading vibe that was from my sister, and I went straight for the sports section.
That's awesome. Now you dedicate the most recent book to her, I believe.
Yes.
That's so cool.
She's one of my closest friends, and she's had a particularly difficult year. So I wanted to throw down the dedication to her. I appreciate you noticing that.
Yeah. Oh, that's so cool. I mean, obviously, I've had a lot of guests on who talk about their parents and shaping their literary lives, and so cool to talk about your older sister too. That's great.
It's funny. I was joking the other day with my wife that when I was growing up, I thought having an older sister was like the worst of all worlds. Because if you have an older brother, they teach you the ropes. If you have a younger brother or sister, you can look out for them. But an older sister, you just get nothing from that relationship. I used to walk around saying that, like, I get nothing from this relationship, while at the same time I'm reading, you know,
Sure.
Maya Angelou
Sure.
because she's leaving it around the house.
No doubt. What else? What else? The name of the podcast is the Chills at Will podcast. This idea of those thrilling works, those ones that you can quote, those writers, those texts. Who else, as you got a little bit older, who were really thrilling you with their works?
Oh, I mean, it was James Baldwin, his fiction, not his, I think now more famous nonfiction essays.
Okay.
I just, I frankly, I was dating somebody who was really into Baldwin as a writer, as
Mm.
literature, and I'd never experienced Baldwin as literature. I'd read some of the political stuff in history class, and books like Another Country are what comes tumbling out of my mouth when people say, "Quick, what's the best work of fiction you've ever read in your life?" And I'm like, "Another Country" by James Baldwin.
Mm.
So that's the one that really sends the chills up my spine, and that's also what I go back to. I mean, I'm one of those people who likes rereading books. Also,
Yes.
that's a big thing for me.
Sure.
I never understood why people like rewatching movies, but somehow turn their nose up at rereading books. Um, I always get more out of it on the second reading, especially if it's something special. And yeah, I just recently reread Another Country, and it more than held up. It
Yeah.
seemed prophetic.
Oh, that's a great point about the rereading for sure. So I wonder where sports fit in as a kid. I mean, were you also reading, Frank DeFord and
Oh yeah.
all the great sports writers? Was there an overlap? Were you reading it for like, oh, cool, the X's and O's and sports and tackles and dunks, or were you reading it for like also enjoying and appreciating the literary greatness?
Oh, my mom got me a subscription to Sports Illustrated when I was
Yes.
8 years old. And so every Thursday when it got to the house was a day of me just, poring over it, every last page. And I would be done with it by the end of the weekend. And
Right.
so my belief in what sports writing could or should be was really shaped by two very strong currents. One was the very literary sports writing, as you
Mhm.
correctly describe it. People like Frank DeFord and Curry Kirkpatrick, and I really like Selena Roberts. I remember that. Lee
Mm.
Montville, Jack McCallum. I mean, they they were people who. Oh my God, Ralph Wiley in a
Ralph
huge way.
Wiley, may he rest in peace. Yes.
Yes, I mean, I just was like that. Those were magnetic names for me to see on a byline. But the other thing my mom did growing up was she made sure we had subscriptions to all the local papers: New York
Oh.
Times, Daily News, New York Post. So I guess not all of them. We didn't have Newsday, but and the New York Times, looked way too much like homework to me.
Mm.
So, the tabloids, the Post and the Daily News, I mean, and starting with the back page with the sports, I mean, that was daily reading for me.
Sure.
And so you have this literary sports writing, I don't know, current.
Mm-hmm.
That was going straight into my brain. But you also had this kind of like very, you know, ink stained wretch
Hmm.
uh columns, you know, the underside of the business, you like real kind of gutter stuff that was coming out of the tabloids, some of which was good, some of it which was profoundly reactionary, but that was the stuff I read.
Uh-huh. There's a great the Ringer did a piece on you, I think maybe 3 years ago, and basically calling you the Kaepernick whisperer, right?
Yeah.
But it talks about you as a, I mean, I think self-professed journalist slash activist, or activist slash journalist. I guess the question is, where did both of those start? And maybe there's, were there Eureka moments where you said, oh man, I can do this journalism thing, people enjoy my work? And then where did, the activism part start? If it's possible to nail it down to one or two.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of key moments. First, I got to just say for the record, I really appreciated the Ringer writing that, but man, that title brought me a lot of grief.
Uh,
The Kaepernick whisperer. I wasn't whispering anything to Colin. I know Colin, but I wasn't whispering in his ear. He acts by his
sure.
own volition, and it gave off a vibe that was very unfortunate.
Mm-hmm.
But that's neither here nor there. There were a couple of big moments for me. The idea of just being an activist, of doing something about the world, I mean, that for me started in college. It just, the world just seemed like a fundamentally unjust place to me. And I wanted to do something about it. And I went to a college, McAllister, where there were opportunities to be part of rallies, be part of protests. It was a very live political culture on campus, and that was very attractive to me. But I also loved sports, which was not a big thing on campus at all. McAllister's most famous sporting accomplishment is having the longest losing streak in football history at the Division III level, and you would get more people to come out to a book talk than you would to a football game.
Uh-huh.
So it's very much like a D3 small school. We were the Fighting Scots of McAllister, and so I never gave a great deal of thought of combining those two worlds, like my love of sports and politics, because politics was so hegemonic on campus, and so sports was like the quiet thing I did in the corner.
Sure.
Um, and then there was a basketball player named Mahmoud Abdul Rauf in, I believe, '96, who made the decision that he wasn't going to come out for the national anthem. And I followed that story incredibly closely. And I remember hearing some of the people on ESPN say, well, he must see himself in the tradition of those athlete activists like Muhammad Ali or Billie Jean King. And I'd never even heard of that phrase before, athlete activists. And it made me want to know what that was, what it was historically, what it meant to the movements that were concurrent with those athlete activists. And so I started doing a deep dive of research, and it just sort of became my ideal of what I wanted to do for a living, was write about this history of sports and politics. So McAllister didn't have any sort of journalism undergrad major or anything like that. But I was fortunate to be in that time where it was just like the explosion of the internet was bubbling up while I was at school. And that means that the internet had yet to destroy local newspapers.
Yes, correct.
And so I was able to do, I got advice from people. I said, should I go to journalism grad school? And back then, someone really could say to you, no, get a job on a newspaper. You'll learn just as much and you won't have tens of thousands of dollars in debt. I said, okay. So I got a job at a newspaper, worked my way up at several papers. And but what I always said to them was, I really need a space to write a sports column that has a political bent. Because I just wanted to exercise it. I wanted to work my chops and see if I could do this on a weekly basis. And so I would sell ads for the paper. I would do layout. I would sweep up whatever it took, as long as I was able to have that little bit of real estate in the paper to write about sports and politics. And I would have been happy doing that forever. But there's volatility in that industry, and my brother-in-law at the time put my columns up online, and it got the attention of the nation, and they offered me a gig, and that was 15 years ago.
Wow. Who we'll get back obviously to the career and to the books. Who are you reading now that the thrilling writers. I mean, you mentioned some. It's not like they were thousands of years ago, but who are some of the up and coming or currently publishing who you really enjoy reading?
Well, they're not up and coming at all, but I've been reading a lot of the work of David Marinus. I mean, he's
Mm-hmm.
uh, might be in his early 70s, I think. But
Mm-hmm.
David Marinus, I'm reading his book, Good American Family, and I still think he's the best journalist we've got.
Wow.
It's talk about chills at will. People
Huh.
read A Good American Family. It's about his father getting blacklisted, and the experience of growing up with his father after the blacklist. It's unbelievable.
Oh wow.
Um, and Howard Bryant's books on sports and politics have also been
Yes.
both inspirational and just very helpful. I actually opened the book Kaepernick Effect with a quote from Howard Bryant because I
Mm-hmm.
thought it really summed up what's so powerful about the taking of that knee during
Mm-hmm.
the anthem. But those are two who directly come to mind. There are so many more. I
Right.
love Lindsay Adler's baseball writing. I could pick people out who I go to every week
Sure.
and enjoy. But as far as the books I've read recently that deal with this sports and politics coming together and the like, definitely Howard Bryant's work,
Yes.
and definitely I'll throw out David Marinus's name again.
Yeah. Yeah, I love how Howard Bryant is I mean, obviously his political, his meditations on race and society. I also love he's a tennis fan. I'm a big tennis fan myself, and I love reading his stuff on Twitter and all that. It's tennis maybe has it's kind of gone down in some popularity, but I love that he still keeps it going.
Well, I had the opportunity over the summer, first time in my entire life. I've been playing tennis my whole life. I'd never
Oh,
played on
nice.
a grass court before.
Oh,
And I played on a grass court for the first time. Basically, someone smuggled me into a club, and I was able to get an hour onto the courts. And Howard was the first person I texted because I was like, who would appreciate an hour on a grass court?
yeah.
And so I texted Howard about that, and it
Uh,
was so cool.
I
Oh,
bet that is so cool. What you can play the fifth on this, but have you ever played slash beat Howard in tennis or?
never have played
Okay.
and never could beat.
Okay.
I'll say both those things.
Okay.
No need to plead the fifth on that. I'm just I'm barely a weekend warrior. I mean, for me, it's
uh,
like I hadn't played for many years, but then with the pandemic, it was just like, wow, this is there are
it
free
is.
courts all over
Yes.
where I live, and it's the perfect social distancing sport where you can be social with somebody.
Totally. Totally. With the nation and then with the Edge of Sports podcast, obviously there's a combination, like you said, of politics and sport. I go back to the line in the Kaepernick book, the line about a Donald Foyle,
Hmm.
where I don't think it was you as a narrator. I think it was somebody quoted saying basically like the idea of like this gap between the Jim Browns who you talk about, the John Carlos, of course, Muhammad Ali and such. And obviously there were people doing the work. There
Hmm.
was Craig Hodges, there was Mahmoud Abdul Rauf, like you talked about. There were so many more.
Donald Boyle.
A Donald Foyle, but the quote was something like, in those days, it was a Donald Foyle talking about, campaign finance reform. It wasn't
Mhm.
as sexy as, what's going on these days. I guess my long-winded question is, since 2005, 2006, since you started kind of officially, was there that gap, or was it just like there was no social media, there wasn't as much coverage? How do you see that gap between, let's, say 2005, 2000, and like 2014?
Oh, I mean, the water was dry when
Huh.
I was when my first 10 years of doing this work. I mean,
Oh,
you would search and scrape for things to write about, and a lot of what I wrote about during that time was about the past. I
sure.
mean, I wrote a great deal about the '60s, a great deal about the '70s,
Mm-hmm.
as a way to inspire a new generation of athletes
Mm-hmm.
to speak out. So there were instances, but it really was like finding them, and then I guess I don't want to say overstating them, but certainly holding it up and so you could say to the world, you see, these are more than just athletes. They have
Right.
not only political ideas, they have political influence.
Right.
And And that changed. It wasn't just social media which changed this dynamic. I mean, it was the combination of three things. It was social media. It was the Black Lives Matter movement, because if
Mm-hmm.
you know sports history, you know that having a movement off the field is critical
Mm.
to see it ricochet on the field. And you also have just the very existence of LeBron James.
Hmm.
Was a cultural game changer. The fact that he wanted to use the platform and to be political. And also, by the way, he's only arguably the greatest basketball player to ever live. Although Jordan fans will get mad at me, he's in the top two.
Mm-hmm.
That was a game changer culturally.
Okay.
It was like he bent the sports culture to accommodate his greatness
Mm-hmm.
because of his ability to generate so much wealth for the industry itself.
Mm-hmm.
And so that combination is what changed things so much. And it's also led to the growth of a new generation of sports politics writing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even folks like, that have been doing it for a long time, that they've sort of reemerged, and I love this, and sort of recreated themselves as sports politics writers.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the examples are all over the place, but like somebody who might have been a basketball writer in the 90s is now editing social justice columns about sports for the Washington Post.
Sure.
And I think that that's a good thing, because I mean, it's not only athletes who are finding that there are other things they can talk about other than what's in the box score. It's the journalist who's finding more space to explore what they want to write about and
Mm-hmm.
explore as well.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, the Donald Foyle was actually from the Ringer article and not from the book. And the quote is, there was a less woke time, let's call it 2005, when Dave Zirin didn't make nearly this much sense. It wasn't that he was wrong about the possibilities of athlete activism. It was that there was something almost comic about searching for Ali's heir and finding ... ellipses a Donald Foyle talking about campaign finance reform.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, I would argue that there's some fanciful cynicism there as well, because,
Sure.
God bless a Donald Foyle.
Yes.
I mean, he did what he did, and he did what he felt like he had to do. And I'd interviewed a Donald Foyle, and he said that Ali gave him confidence to do what he did, and that's something that should be celebrated, not because what a Donald Foyle was doing was necessarily so radical, but because you have to see it as a bridge.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the bridge is going to be really firm to walk upon, and sometimes it's going to be rickety, and you're going to be over a Sylvester Stallone cliffhanger style crevasse. But you still need that part of the bridge. And a
Sure.
Donald Foyle, a Ton Thomas, people like that, they were the bridge at a time when it was very difficult and perilous.
Definitely. And no doubt, not trying to bring shade, definitely
Oh,
celebrating
no,
Donald Foyle and others, definitely. And
it's more my response to the tone of the article than
sure,
the
right.
reality, which is true. That
Yeah.
it was that was a leaner time.
Sure. Right. And very nice job on the Sylvester Stallone metaphor there. That was nicely done.
Oh, anytime you can incorporate a film with Michael Rooker in it, you have to do that.
Obviously, you've done many other books, many other great books. Perhaps maybe best known, or one of best known, is The People's History of Sports in the United States. Last name is close to Zinn, Zinn, right?
Yes.
Of course, with the People's, was it called The People's History of the United States?
Yep.
What did you feel like what the need was for, or what was your point, your purpose in writing The People's History of Sports in the United States?
Well, it started when I did a couple of events with Howard Zinn, and he was a big sports fan, and so he liked my writing, and we knew a couple people in common, so we did a couple of events together. I did an event I'll never forget with he and Jim Bouton, the great pitcher, who wrote Ball 4, which is the great sports autobiography, and Jim just passed away.
Right.
But these two guys were huge fans of each other, and they'd never met. And so being able to bring together Howard Zinn and Jim Bouton for one event, I mean, that was the sort of thing where I was like, am I dreaming? Am I in heaven right now? Because Jim Bouton was who I read when I was growing up, and Howard Zinn was my political mentor, even though we'd never met. And now here I am on a stage introducing them. And it was, talk about chills at will. That was something. And Howard was already in the process with the New Press of sort of having an imprint on a series, like A People's History of the Americas, A People's History of The Global South is one of them. And I said I would love to do a people's history of sports. I feel like that's going to be done anyway, so it might as well be me who does it. And Howard gave it his blessing, and the New Press was off and running with it. And I mean, I didn't feel like I was prepared or ready at that point in my career to actually do it. And I think I'd write a better one now. But honestly, I felt almost up against a clock. Like, it's just too obvious an idea. Someone will write this book. And I'm the guy who loves Howard Zinn, and I'm the guy who wants to do this. So that's how that book got made. And wow, that was a long time ago. I mean, a lot of times classes will read that and they'll bring me in to talk about it. And the question is, what would you do now? And I would say, well, I would beg for, 30,000 more words to talk about the last 10 years.
Sure. Right.
No doubt about it. Volatile.
No doubt about it. Great segue into the Kaepernick Effect, which again comes out just in 3 days, September 14th. Buy it, buy it, buy it. I'm lucky to have a copy over here on my right shoulder. And, I'm in Sacramento, so I'm close to the Bay Area. I've been a Niners fan. I've definitely not as big of a football fan for sure, for many reasons. One's the Colin Kaepernick story. One is, Junior Seau and all those who've been so affected by, concussions and such. But anyways, I was, seemed like just a few years ago when Colin was on top of the world and almost led them to the Super Bowl and stuff. And obviously just by the title, I should have known more that I was thinking it would be more about Colin himself. And obviously it's about the effect.
Yeah.
And it's, positioned so perfectly in 2020, 2021 with, everything that's happened, read George Floyd, etc. I wonder the genesis of the book.
I mean, the book you said before that there was a great segue to go from that to talking about the Kaepernick Effect. One of the reasons why it's a great segue is because Howard Zinn, who passed away in 2010, was really a root cause of why I wanted to write it. Because imagine the scenario. We're at the very start of the pandemic, and I'm looking around, and a lot of people are saying, wow, the Black Lives Matter movement has stalled out, basically. And what's going to revive it? And I wasn't part of those discussions, but what was sort of rankling me was, when people are assessing the movement, and I was reading these assessments of it and what's gone wrong over the previous few years, and whether Donald Trump's existence had made people feel a sense of pessimism that they can do anything or that they could win. That was a lot of what I was reading. And no one was talking about these sort of stories of young people, young athletes who'd taken a knee in their hometown. And I knew these stories because I'd written about them for The Nation, or I'd read about them on like little AP reports, but I hadn't seen anything that was cumulative.
Right.
Or not that it would categorize every single one, but that it would have an analysis of what these things are, and also a preservation that they even happened and that they wouldn't be memory hold, because so much of social history in this country is memory hold.
Sure.
And the great contribution of Howard Zinn was like rescuing so much. I mean, Howard Zinn has probably launched more dissertations than any history writer ever.
That's true.
Because he just saved so much basic history that now we have tons of books about. But before Howard, it was, there were like just stories about labor, stories about indigenous struggles, stories about the civil rights movement in the South and SNCC. I mean, these were things that you would really have to go through the libraries to try to read about. And Howard repopularized that we need to know these stories. And so I was like, I want to do something in the tradition of Howard Zinn where I just save these stories from being memory hold. So that was the genesis of it. And it was hard to find a publisher who was into that as an idea. And fortunately, the New Press, which is the home of so much of Howard's work, they got it and they said, all right, let's do it.
Nice.
But then the point of the book changed dramatically as summer of 2020 happened. And you have the largest protests in the history of the United States after the police murder of George Floyd. And we don't say that enough or talk about that enough, that these are the largest in history. They were in all 50 states. That has never happened before, ever, in the United States. And now, as I'd been, I'd interviewed several dozen people by the time summer hit, and clearly the book had changed in my mind. That no longer was it a book about rescuing what these folks did from the memory hole of history, but it was now about explaining that there are many roads that led to the summer of 2020.
Right.
But one of those roads runs straight through the playing fields of the United States. And when I went back and called some of the people that I'd interviewed up to that point, they were all in the streets. They were all organizing people. I mean, these were young people who, when they protested, for most of them, it was like the first activist-y thing they'd ever done in their life.
Mm-hmm.
Was take a knee or raise a fist during the anthem. And now all of a sudden they're street organizers in the largest protests in U.S. history. So the whole point of the book changed because the world changed.
Sure. Yes. And you make a great point that the greatness of the book is the cumulative effect, putting them all together, memorializing them, giving some context, and the perfect number too. I mean, I'm sure you aren't physically able to do every single episode of, and that would be too much, but it's a good number, and it's enough where it's like you remember their stories, you individualize their stories.
And I left a bunch on the cutting room floor. I mean, it was, and that was incredibly painful. And each time I did that, it was accompanied by a phone call, an apology, and a promise of a free book. And nobody was salty about it. They understood. But it's so important. I think we need to write with one eye on our reader. And I really wanted it to be something that people could read without the effect of it becoming deadening.
Sure. Yes. One kind of X's and O's thing before we talk more about the book, about Colin Kaepernick. Can you put to rest the whole, revisionist history that he just wasn't a good enough quarterback?
Yes, that's become a right-wing talking point, because it sure as heck isn't a football talking point unless the person actively doesn't know anything about football. Colin Kaepernick did not start the first 4 games of his last season in the NFL, so he played the final 12 games. He threw for 16 touchdowns, only 4 interceptions, and he led the National Football League in yards per carry, and his team, which was awful, led the NFL in drops. Right. So his actual statistics, which you can measure by advanced statistics, had him as one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL that year. When you factor in things like drop passes and things of that nature, and it's an absolute absurdity that he's been denied work. And and we all know why it is. It's because he took part in these protests, and it's because NFL owners are incredibly right-wing. And they like using Colin Kaepernick as a ghost story to frighten young players, to say, don't act out or else you can end up like Colin Kaepernick. And it's highly racialized, because you've got a 70% black workforce. You are no black franchise owners. And, they're making it very clear as to which side they're on and as to what, they want to see. And frankly, what they want to see is a world of quiet, profit-producing football players. What they don't want to see, despite their protestations, is Super Bowl trophies and winning. Because if they did, Colin Kaepernick's politics would not matter a damn.
Sure. Yeah, I always thought it was ironic or interesting or whatever that, known as such a liberal city as San Francisco, even there he couldn't make it. It doesn't mean it makes the owners liberal or anything like that, but
sure.
Right. The book starts off with, I got to assume it was towards the end of your writing, very interesting juxtaposition of the knees, right? Him taking a knee, of course, and then the horrific knee from Derek Chauvin, right? With George Floyd.
Yeah.
And we know right away this is
nearly 25 years ago, lawmakers passed comprehensive internet regulations.
I just had some weird sound going. Was that yours or mine?
Mine's got no sound.
That was weird. I had some weird advertisement or something come on. Anyways, today's episode is brought to you by, no, just kidding. But you know,
Did
and
hear
then
that.
that was so weird. I don't know where it came from. It went off on its own. You know, later talking about, of course, his quote and how he got into doing what he did, describing it and how he talked to Nate Boyer and everything like that. You know, the ridiculousness, obviously, of making anyone, like forcing someone to be patriotic is ridiculous. You know, forcing an African American with our history to do that is, you know, equally weird. And he talks about that. You also talk about Steve Weish and how he in 2016 was the one for NFL Network who, you know, who kind of broke the story. How do you just recently had him on your show? How would you sum up how he feels 5 years later? Talking about Steve Weish.
What's so great about Steve Weish is that he's got this terrific historical and political grounding. So I think a lot of reporters, if they would happen to have really opened that can of worms, might be sick of talking about it by now, 5 years later. And I even said that to Steve. I said, "Are you sick of answering these questions?" And he clearly feels a sense of historical accountability. So he has, because he's part of history. So he has no problem whatsoever. He'll answer questions about this 100 times a day for 100 years and not blink. He understands that he's actually been bequeathed with a responsibility to do exactly that. So, and I think that approach, I learned a lot from Steve, and just sort of hearing his approach to the question of, do I still need to talk about this 5 years later? Like, his answer is, you're damn right.
Yeah. You make some really interesting and right on comparisons between, Colin and Muhammad Ali, just how, you intimate it more so, Ali was hated in his day in many ways,
Sure.
right? And obviously, by the time he'd passed away, he was an American hero, et cetera, et cetera. But, people don't forget that,
Right.
Cap as well was, I know ahead of his time is always kind of an overused term, but then later on, kind of like the commodification, if that's the term, like the commercialization of the knee,
right,
where it almost has lost some of its significance, but you ground us very well in like, hey, Colin did it, and here's the reasons why, with some of his quotes.
and also the question of context is so important. When
Mhm.
people say like taking a knee is passe, it's like, all right, it might be passe if it's a team approved activity
Sure.
in West London, but it sure as hell isn't passe in Beaumont, Texas.
Right, no doubt about it. And so you basically break the book into three sections, which are high school, college, and pro. You start off with, which I appreciate knowing, he was the first athlete, I believe is how you phrase it, is Rodney Axen Jr. out of Ohio.
Yeah.
He was the first one. He was at a school, I believe a majority white school, where his teammates would literally use the racial slur.
Mm-hmm.
And then, the old like, oh, no, but you're kind of like, you're one of us, or you're
Yeah.
different. And, all those, that wouldn't be a microaggression, that'd be a macroaggression. All the other, microaggressions. And he felt like, hey, I have to speak with my conscience, or speak my conscience, speak my truth. And he was one of the first.
Yeah.
April Parkerson, I believe, was a parent,
Mm-hmm.
right? And talking about encouraging her son or daughter, I think it was
Or her son in Beaumont, Texas.
Beaumont,
Yeah.
Texas, that you keep referring to. What is it? You keep coming back to Beaumont, Texas. Can you talk a little bit about that atmosphere that made it so courageous?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's right next door to what they used to call, and I guess still call, a sundown town. I mean, and where you have, and also right by where a KKK Grand Wizard lives. I mean, it's a very intense area, and this, oh, excuse me for that door. And for this all Black youth football team, this idea of taking a knee seemed very logical, and they knew there would be some fallout, but they had no idea that one of the fallouts would be the actual canceling of the team in the league.
Yeah.
Like, rather than deal with these young people, they chose to just shut it all down. And they just would have been without sports for having the crime of saying, gee, we think police brutality is bad.
Sure.
And it actually took, what's so interesting about this story is that several NFL players got wind of it and donated money for equipment and for infrastructure, so a new league could start, and then the Beaumont Bulls could be reborn. Now, and that's a good example to me of like a story that was out there in the media and picked up decently well, but without context, without any sense that this had been happening in other places, without any sense that this is more than just, oh, gee, that guy Colin Kaepernick did it, now I'm going to do it. But no, there's a whole there's a whole background, there's a whole atmosphere where this is taking place.
Yeah, so you go on to talk about some a great combination, some of the coaches in particular, some players, some cheerleaders. I was especially struck by, I want to say, Denby High School in Detroit. Detroit is clearly known as, majority African American, like in the city, in the suburbs, right? Auburn Hills or those kind of things.
Yeah.
And just the like absolute vitriol and abuse that happened after one of those games when this team from, I think, Denby High School goes and plays in the suburbs. Just all this backlash that comes, which you explained very well. There's Garfield High School, of course, I knew from Jimi Hendrix. Right. And
Quincy Jones.
Yes. I didn't know he was from that area. John Finkel has a great book about Seattle's basketball history and, some of the players from there. But, is known to be very socially forward and progressive. And, all these schools that you mentioned, all these athletes, some got a lot of feedback, positive feedback, and a lot of them got attacked by these not social justice warriors, keyboard warriors.
Yeah.
Right. People on Twitter, etc. There was some talk about that. And I believe one of the last, if not the last in the high school was Marjan Sidar. Am I saying the name correctly?
Well, he was the teacher and advisor of the students in Minneapolis who, wow, if only the police department had listened to them. Think of the anguish that could have been saved. But they were taking a knee on their road to winning the city championship, state championship, I believe, from Minneapolis North. And it's been wonderful to be in contact with those folks. I got to tell you, doing that part of the story meant a lot to me because I went to college in the Twin Cities, the college I mentioned earlier, McAllister. And, I did a lot of work in Minneapolis while I was there. McAllister's in St. Paul. So just a strong connection felt to that story in particular. And not just because of what was happening in Minneapolis, but because of my own roots.
Right. Yeah. He was so interesting in many ways because he has the connections to the, Black Power movement, civil rights movement. Obviously a teacher, doing great things. And, there's Beaumont, Texas, and maybe some of the stereotypical South. And there's one girl from New Orleans, I believe. There's also, Minnesota Nice, which you talk about. And, Minnesota obviously has been at the forefront of all kinds of things like this. And, some of these conservative states. And, I am, of course, struck, and I'm sure you were, by the courage of so many of these young people, myself being a high school teacher. I want to end with the high school part, asking you, like, there were a lot of negative things, for sure. Racist to the extreme. Where do you balance the, like, being inspired by them, being, optimistic about the future for these, these people who are fighting for our future, and then some of the negative things that you had to write about?
Oh, I'm profoundly optimistic because the people who I spoke with, I mean, I'm not profoundly optimistic about the state of the world in 2021. I'm profoundly optimistic about the generation that my daughter is in, the generation that my son is in, that they're just not going to settle for what other generations have had to settle for. I think this generation is, more demographically diverse and less tolerant of intolerance than any generation in the history of the United States. And they're going to let themselves be heard before this is all done. And I know these stories can contain a lot about backlash and a lot about high school students who are taking all this heat for daring to stand up for what they believe in. But we also have to look at it like this. They have no regrets about what they did. If anything, they feel emboldened about it. And I really do believe if we can just get this book into some hands and into some classrooms, young people are going to read it and say, hey, that could be me.
Sure.
That could be me. I want to be the one to start the assembly at my school because I protest during a sporting event. I am going to use the leverage that's created by me being an athlete, which other people get stuff out of even at the high school level. Like, so much of a community gets something out of high school sports. It's like, why shouldn't they also have a say about their world?
No doubt about it. You speaking about generations, the section about college, I was struck by, I mean, obviously you wrote a lot about it and it made a lot of sense. I was struck by the, Trayvon Martin as a marker for especially like the college generation, right? They were kind of coming of age,
Me too.
right? And so, then there's maybe the George Floyd generation, etc. But there, you talk, and obviously in college, and there's a lot going on now with that. It can be, and it's often very exploitative, right? I mean, you look at the budgets of Ohio State and Texas and these schools, and it's just ridiculous. And then you get, like you talk about players who don't get health benefits, who don't get any sort of, pay, and on and on and on. Coaches, Dabo Sweeney's making $900 million a year. I'm exaggerating.
Barely.
Yet he can't make right. Yet he can't make any comments about Black Lives Matter. Sorry if I'm misquoting that from Dabo, but right, that kind of thing.
No. It was worse than that. It was snarky and dismissive.
Correct. And so you start off with Alexis Bazin, if I'm pronouncing the name correctly, a cheerleader in the Ivy League at Penn, and she was, stood up very strong. I was just blown away by the confidence, because how can you not be confident when you're doing the right thing, right?
I mean, that's the other thing I think people can get out of this. It goes back to your first question. Like, I feel very energized in terms of just being able to talk about this book and speak to people like yourself, because I think there's a message that sort of pays itself forward. Like, it's not about me and what I think. It's about Alexis Bazin. It's about people reading about her confidence and getting something out of that.
Right. And you make a great point too. Obviously there's the Ohio States and the Texas and those huge universities, but in a way, the smaller, the D2s, the D3s, they almost have more of an outsized, effect, meaning the players do, right? They're in small towns. This is the place where the whole town comes out on a Saturday. So when they, at these small schools like St. Michael's in Vermont, etc., when they make these political stances, it may have even more effects, right?
Right. No, absolutely.
And even-handed, or maybe not so much. Some really, again, positive feedback for some of these athletes, and some were absolutely attacked and death threats and horrific things towards them. There's Michael Rose-Ivy from Nebraska. I wonder if he was in a smaller way, like Colin Kaepernick, would, like, if his NFL hopes were dashed. Like, how does that work? I mean, is that like just owners get together and say, not this guy? Is it more subtle?
No, I mean, it's openly talked about. Well, I shouldn't say openly, because it's not like it's on ESPN, but my understanding is that they do these things that are euphemistically called character assessments of each of these players, full psychological profiles.
Sure.
They, from their perspective, they're investing millions of dollars in somebody who's, barely old enough to buy a beer. And they want to make sure that this person is going to be worth that investment at a very volatile age. And who among us wouldn't be volatile, being handed several $1 million at age 21? I certainly would have been volatile. But they view politics as being an element in that volatility. And so unless you live, breathe, eat, and sleep football / baseball / volleyball / basketball / soccer, there's something somehow wrong about you and deficient. And so politics gets put in this broad matrix of lack of focus,
right?
Which could be a death knell for somebody who is a borderline prospect.
Right, exactly. Very interesting about some of the backlash for students. The player from UCSB, McHale, maybe, right, and just about how she was called back or emailed or texted, 3 or 4 years later, like, what can I do? What can I do? And she felt like a lot of it was just was too little, too late. Was more like, let me just regain my face, so to speak, right? It wasn't true, allyship or accomplishmentship, as you would call it. Kind of end with the college part about, some of the white players. I wonder your thoughts maybe on the term of like a white ally versus like a white accomplice, or, like, is ally too passive of a word?
It is, but sometimes I feel like we're just arguing about nomenclature.
Sure.
Like people say, I'm not an ally, I'm an accomplice. And it's like, what are you actually doing? You know, it's like, I don't really care what one calls themselves as long as they're acting in solidarity.
Sure.
And also with a degree of self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Like, one of the things I like about Megan Rapinoe, who I interview in the book, is
Yeah.
that she's self-aware about the fact that, yeah, she's white, she's doing this, and she's, you know, even though she's doing exactly the same thing that Colin Kaepernick did, she's not going to suffer like
No.
Colin Kaepernick did.
No.
I don't think she expected her reputation to be burnished and for her to
Sure.
be doing Subway commercials. That's kind of a wild twist on this, but at least she gets the way of the walk.
Yeah. Do you think that with all the, all the stuff about like being able to sell your likeness and make money, in college now, do you think that's going to be another thing that, do you think that's something that's going to give more freedom to college players?
It's
Or
a
is that
step
something
in the
that's gonna
right direction,
Uh-huh.
but it's not a cure-all by any stretch.
Yeah.
It's going to benefit the best known high school prospects and use to
Mhm.
lure them to different campuses, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's better them having this right than not having this right, because anybody should have the right to be able to say, yeah, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. Like, the idea that they would be constrained because they play a sport is absolutely absurd. But we still need to address the fact that college sports, the revenue producing ones, produce billions upon billions of dollars,
Yes.
and they're not safe. It's not something that's shared. It's not
Mhm.
something that people benefit from who actually do the work. So until that's corrected, we're still going to have these problems.
In the book, the last part of the trifecta, not including the epilogue, is about the pros. And mad respect for your Simpsons quote. I'm a big Simpsons fan.
Ooh, yeah.
But you start with Eric Reed, who was, Colin's teammate. And you talk about him literally seeing a cross burning when he was growing up, right?
Yes.
And it wasn't like that was 1915. I mean, he's, that
No.
was not that long ago. But also very much motivated by his religious faith. And somebody who was who you interview as having said that he's so inspired by the young people, and obviously vice versa, right? There's Bruce Maxwell. I really appreciate you sharing his story. I knew a little bit about him, in the major leagues. This is a major leagues that had guys like John Rocker, although it was a long time ago, and is known to be very conservative. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, very much so.
Right. Not inviting the African Americans. Bruce Maxwell's career suffered. He now plays in Mexico. He's not in the major leagues anymore. Right.
Well, I think he's hooked up with a club now.
Oh, good.
Which is
Good.
great. It took several years.
Right. And he talks about, he talks about the hypocrisy of the major leagues. If there's, celebration of Jackie Robinson every year, as there should be, and the retired number and the whole deal, but just the idea of like, hey, we're the league that brought Jackie Robinson, yet
Exactly.
Right. But Bruce Maxwell gets, basically pushed out of the league. Gwen Berry, who I know is fairly recent, has been in the news recently. That is, she threw up the fist in the proud tradition of, of the San Jose State folks and all of that. Ferocious backlash against her. I wonder how much of that you think is because she's a woman and as a Black woman.
Well, she's an uncompromising Black woman from Ferguson, Missouri, and I think sometimes that's all it takes to get a ferocious backlash.
Yeah, right, exactly. Literally from Ferguson. Kenny Stills, Camp Pendleton, his coaches were literally military men. His friends are military men, his teammates. And he talks about how when he did the knee, that it was a lot of backlash, a lot of the conflation of patriotism and the military and the flag. And I wanted to ask you about that too. One of the coaches early on in high school talked about how, come on, even in my day, like, what is this about playing the national anthem, right? I mean, how much did the NFL pay, right, for like the flyovers and the whole deal?
Yeah, the salute to service, tribute to the troops partnership with the Pentagon.
What have you seen in the last 15, 20 years on just that ridiculous conflation of like why are we even doing the national anthem at a sporting event?
Well, it's been amped up to 11 by 9/11. And this is Howard Bryant's book, The Heritage, is all about this, about the ways in which this Black athletic revolt is also understood as also being a reaction to the politics in sports post 9/11.
Sure.
That this idea that we do live in the, like, where sports is this political terrain, and as long as it's politicized, don't be surprised if people push back against it.
No doubt about it. Yeah, I'll never get over that. This idea that, it's like we have to do the national anthem, and as you talk about the third verse, which is ridiculously racist, and just forced patriotism to me seems like a paradox or an oxymoron. Lee Tice, I don't know if I'm saying the last name correctly, in my city of Sacramento.
Yeah, yeah, I believe.
Right, a singer. She's from the Bay Area, but I believe she sang at the Kings game, Sacramento Kings.
Yes.
She's a white woman, is that correct?
Yes.
And she talked about there was a fairly muted reaction, but the idea of her again being so courageous to do this, literally singing the national anthem, doing that with a knee. Megan Rapinoe, you talked about. She talks a lot about solidarity, and you end the section with Michael Bennett. He seems to be such an interesting person who's not just an athlete. I don't know if you knew him from before.
Yeah, I did a book with Michael.
Oh, I'm sorry. Of course you did.
Yeah, so I knew Michael well, and I knew he would have something to contribute to this.
Tell us a little bit about him and his view of sports as not being everything in the world.
Yeah, it's just he's got a great sense of perspective, and he was in Seattle playing for the Seahawks at a time when a woman named Charlena Lyles was killed by police, and that made him realize that he needed to do more than be like a Bernie Sanders voter, which he was. He needed to take his activism to the field and let people know that this was not a time for fun and games.
And he, what I really appreciate about him is he ended the book right before the epilogue was, all of these struggles are our struggles, right? I mean, Megan Rapinoe as an out, lesbian, like all of these struggles are our struggles. And Michael says, Palestine, and like these are human connections. These are stories that we need to be a part of, the human connections. You end the epilogue with the great Dr. John Carlos, who's been, a steadfast supporter of racial justice, equal rights since, since he was born, I guess, right? And pretty close.
Oh yeah.
And the title of that last chapter is "We Are the Positive Force." And to see him, that real bookend ending, right, where he himself is inspired by the young people, and while he could easily talk about hate, he talks about love, and that's hard to see how someone like that could continue to talk about love after all he's gone through, but also really inspiring, right?
No, absolutely.
Yeah. Did you meet him for the book? Had you known him from before?
Yeah, I mean, I've known John for almost 20 years. And I did his book with him, his memoir, the John Carlos story. And we've become like family over the years. And I was going to write my own epilogue, but I thought John's words were perfect, and it fit the mood of the book of really giving the stage, giving the ground, centering other voices.
And I'm sorry, I had known that too, that you read in the book.
Oh, it's okay.
I'm a little nervous because I'm trying to make sure that, well, you know what, this interview is going to go down with the Michael Jordan flu game.
Don't worry about
it. Right. Dave Zirin has put on an incredible performance while laid up in bed with the back. I really, really appreciate your time. In my little corner of the world, I'm going to promote the heck out of this book.
Thank you.
And it is, such a good book, of course, and also such an important book.
Thank you. I couldn't appreciate that more. Thank you so much for having me on Chills at Will.
No doubt. And it's going to go into my high school classroom library for sure. Enjoy the Orioles. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
This guy over here waiting patiently.
Let's go. Thanks for waiting. Thanks for sharing your dad with me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, let's see how many innings my back lasts during this game.
Continue great luck to you. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. Be well.
You too.